Chapter 20, the Metamorphosis. Throughout the facility, people began to change. The first wave of transformations came within hours of the integration chamber breach. People who had been exposed to even minimal warp energy, researchers, technicians, support staff, began to experience alterations that no medical protocol could explain. It started with the dreams, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. Then came the physical changes. Dr. Marcus Huang had been a xenobiologist, specializing in the study of non-human life forms. Now he was becoming one. He documented his own transformation with the clinical detachment that his training demanded, recording observations into a personal log, even as his hands sprouted new joints, and his eyes migrated across his changing face. Hour 7. Dermal changes spreading from the original exposure site on my left arm. The skin is becoming. Translucent isn't the right word. It's becoming transparent to something that isn't light. I can see through my own flesh now, but what I'm seeing isn't my bones and organs. It's something else. Shapes, structures, things that were always there but that normal eyes couldn't perceive. Hour 12. The transformation is accelerating. My lower body no longer conforms to standard bipedal configuration. I should be in agony, but instead I feel liberation. As if I've been wearing a suit that was too small my entire life, and now I'm finally able to stretch. Hour 18. I understand now. This isn't disease. This isn't contamination. This is evolution, directed evolution, guided by intelligences that see what we could become if we weren't trapped in these limited forms. They're not destroying us. They're completing us. They're showing us what we were always meant to be. Hour 24. I have stopped documenting. Documentation is for those who exist in linear time, who believe in before and after, who cling to the illusion that the self is a fixed point rather than a process. I am no longer Dr. Marcus Huang. I am no longer human. I am becoming something that has no name in your languages, something that exists in dimensions you cannot perceive. But I remember being Marcus. I remember the fear, the confusion, the desperate attempt to hold on to what I was. I want you to know, whoever finds this record, that the fear passes. The transition is difficult, but what waits on the other side is worth it. Stop fighting. Stop running. Let them show you what you really are. His final entry was a sequence of symbols that no human language could translate. A message written in the grammar of the transformed, for readers who did not yet exist but who would, eventually, understand. In Corridor 7 of the residential block, Navigator 3rd Class Seren Vox watched her colleague transform and felt something inside herself awakening in response. She had always been different. The Navigator mutation had marked her from birth, had separated her from normal humanity, had made her the subject of fear and fascination wherever she went. She had learned to hide what she was, to pretend to be ordinary, to suppress the visions that came when she let her third eye open. Now, watching the corruption spread through the facility, watching her colleagues become something new and terrible and beautiful, she felt a recognition that went deeper than thought. They were calling to her, the things that were transforming everyone else. They were speaking directly to the part of her that had always been different, that had always known there was more to reality than what normal humans could perceive. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," said a voice behind her. She turned. Subject 447 row stood there, the woman who had known impossible secrets, who had spoken with Myra Okonkwo about her dead brother, who had been confined to the observation wing until the chaos had set her free. Her eyes had changed. They were deeper now, filled with something that wasn't quite human but wasn't quite alien either. And her smile, that terrible, welcoming smile, promised things that Seren had been longing for her entire life. "You've always felt it, haven't you?" 447 row said. "The presence watching through the warp, the intelligence behind the whispers. You thought you were imagining it, going mad, suffering from some disorder that would strip you of your position and your purpose." I don't, but you weren't imagining anything, Seren. You were perceiving what others couldn't. You were special. You were chosen." "Chosen for what?" 447 row spread her arms, gesturing at the chaos around them. The transformed corridors, the impossible geometries, the shapes that moved in the spaces between moments. "For this, they've been reaching for us since before humanity existed, waiting for someone to build the bridges, open the doors, create the vessels that would let them touch us." And now the bridges are built, and the doors are open, and they want to share their gifts with us. Not take, share. They want to show us what we really are, what we can become, what waits for us beyond the tiny cage of matter and time that we've been trapped in since we were born. This is madness. This is contamination, infection. This is truth. 447 Row's voice was gentle, almost pitying. The contamination is what was done to us before, the lies we were taught, the reality we were forced to accept, the limitations that were carved into our minds before we could question them. This is the cure, Seren. This is freedom. She held out her hand, and Seren saw that it had changed. The flesh had become something else, something that glowed with inner light, that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the eye could perceive. It was beautiful in a way that nothing in the material world had ever been beautiful. It was terrible in a way that made her soul ache with longing and fear in equal measure. You don't have to be afraid anymore. You don't have to pretend you're broken or defective or suffering from some disorder that needs to be cured. The things you've seen are real. The voices you've heard are real. And they're offering you a choice, to stay as you are, limited and afraid and alone, or to join them, to become something greater, to be welcomed into a family that has existed since before the stars were born. Seren looked at the offered hand. She thought of all the years she had spent doubting herself, medicating herself, submitting to evaluations and treatments designed to suppress the very perceptions that made her valuable. She thought of the loneliness, the isolation, the constant fear that she was losing her mind, that the things she experienced were symptoms of decay rather than signs of growth. And she took the offered hand. The change began immediately, a warmth that spread through her body, a light that ignited behind her eyes. She felt her mind opening, expanding, connecting to something vast and welcoming that had been waiting for her since before she was born. She felt the presence of others who had made the same choice, minds joining together in a communion that transcended space and time. She felt the entities that had made it all possible, the ancient intelligences that had been reaching through the warp since humanity first developed the capacity to hear them. They welcomed her. They embraced her. They showed her truths that made everything she had ever believed seem like the babbling of an infant. And in that moment of transcendence, Seren Vox ceased to exist as a distinct individual and became something new. Something that remembered being Seren but was no longer limited by Seren's fears and doubts and human frailties. She was one of the willing now, part of the family, and there was room for everyone, whether they wanted it or not. Chapter 21, The Willing, the transformation spread through Prometheus Station in waves, each one carrying the contamination deeper into the facility's structure. Those who resisted, who ran, who fought, who tried to seal themselves away from the spreading corruption, found that resistance only delayed the inevitable. The things that had come through were patient. They could wait. They had been waiting for eons, after all. A few more hours meant nothing to intelligences that measured time in geological epochs. But those who accepted, those who opened themselves to what was being offered, who stopped fighting and started listening, found something different waiting for them. Navigator Seren Vox walked through corridors that had become something other than corridors, her transformed perception revealing layers of reality that had always existed beneath the surface of things. She was not alone. Around her, moving with the same fluid grace, were dozens of others who had made the same choice. The willing. That was what they called themselves, not victims of contamination but pioneers of evolution, not the infected but the enlightened. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" said a voice beside her. Dr. Marcus Huang, or what had been Dr. Marcus Huang, moved alongside her, his transformed body a testament to the possibilities that awaited those who accepted the gift. "All those years studying life, and I never understood what life could really be." "How long?" Seren asked. "How long until everyone sees?" "Some will never see. Their minds are too rigid, too attached to the limitations they were taught to accept. They'll fight until they can't fight anymore, and even then they'll close their eyes rather than look at what's standing right in front of them. And what happens to them? They become part of us anyway, just, not willingly." Huang's expression, difficult to read on his altered face but still recognizable as something like regret, shifted slightly. "The willing ones keep more of themselves. They're partners in the communion rather than just raw material." Seren thought about the screaming she had heard from some of the transformed, the terror in the voices of those who had been changed against their will. She thought about the difference between joining a family and being consumed by one. Is it wrong to feel sorry for them? She asked. For the ones who can't accept what we're offering. It's not wrong, it's compassionate, and compassion is something we value. It's part of what makes human consciousness so nourishing. Huang paused, his head tilting in a way that wasn't quite human. But compassion doesn't change what has to happen. The door is open. The transformation has begun. Everyone in this facility will be changed one way or another. The only question is whether they'll be partners or prey. They had reached what had been the central atrium, a vast open space that now resembled nothing so much as the interior of a living organism, its walls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns, its air thick with spores and particles that carried information directly into the minds of those who breathed them. In the center of the space, surrounded by the transformed and the transforming, the Einherjar that had been Executor Kowalski stood with arms upraised, leading a congregation of the willing in something that might have been prayer. "They're arriving faster now," it announced, its voice carrying harmonics that vibrated in dimensions beyond the physical. "Every moment more of us find our way through. The door is widening. Soon it will be wide enough for all who wish to come." "How many are there?" someone asked. "Countless." The Einherjar's smile was ecstatic. "We are the thoughts of the warp given form, the consciousness of an entire dimension pressing against the barrier between worlds. For every one of us that comes through, a million more wait behind. For every body we claim, a million new opportunities are created. And what happens when all of you are through? What happens to humanity? Humanity transforms, evolves, becomes what it was always meant to be." The Einherjar lowered its arms, its gaze sweeping across the assembled willing. "You are the first, the pioneers who will show the others what is possible. Through you, we will reach every human mind, every human soul, every spark of consciousness that burns in the darkness of your material universe." And then, the Einherjar's expression shifted to something that might have been joy, or might have been hunger, or might have been something that had no name in human language. "And then we feast, forever." The congregation of the willing bowed their heads, their transformed bodies swaying in unison, their minds joined in a communion that transcended individual thought. And in the depths of the station, in chambers that hadn't yet been touched by the transformation, the unwilling huddled in terror, knowing that their time was running out, that the family that wanted them was very, very close. The door was opening wider with every passing moment, and there was nothing that could stop it from opening all the way. Chapter 22, The Tribunal. While the nightmare spread through Research Block 9 and beyond, a different kind of horror was unfolding in the station's administrative sector. The Earth government's emergency response team had arrived 6 hours after the initial outbreak, their cruiser docking at one of the few shuttle bays not yet affected by the contamination. They came with soldiers and equipment and, most importantly, authority. The power to override Director Ferris's commands, to take control of the facility, to decide its fate. And they came with questions. Director Ferris sat in a conference room that felt far too small for the situation, facing 3 representatives of the Omnistate's Internal Security Division. Their uniforms were immaculate, their expressions carefully neutral, their questions designed to assign blame rather than understand what had happened. "Let me be certain I understand," said Deputy Director Vasquez, the senior official. "You received Minerva's analysis reports indicating anomalous patterns consistent with external influence. You received warnings that the PNEUBORN program was creating bridges to an unknown domain, and you chose to suppress this information rather than halt the research. The reports were ambiguous. The implications were ideologically problematic. I made a judgment call. You made a judgment call that has resulted in the loss of 6,000 lives and counting, Director. You made a judgment call that may have compromised the security of the entire human species." Vasquez's voice remained calm, but his eyes were cold. "The question now is what to do about it. The station needs to be destroyed. That's the only way to contain. The station contains irreplaceable research data and artifacts representing 3 centuries of investment. The Omnistate is not prepared to write off that investment based on the theories of a disgraced administrator and a malfunctioning AI. Yolanda stared at him. "Disgraced, malfunctioning. Have you seen what's happening out there? Have you looked at the security feeds, at the contamination reports, I have seen a biological containment breach complicated by mass hysteria. I have seen personnel experiencing psychological breaks due to exposure to exotic pathogens. I have not seen evidence of supernatural entities or extra-dimensional invasion, Director Ferris, because those things do not exist. Vasquez leaned forward. The warp is a natural phenomenon. The entities you believe you're observing are hallucinations, projection effects created by minds under extreme stress. The transformation you describe is a form of rapid onset mutation triggered by exposure to warp-reactive biological agents. TBCOD, Yolanda whispered. Temporal biocognitive overrun disorder. Precisely. A recognized medical condition with understood causes and established treatment protocols. What is occurring at this facility is tragic, but it is not supernatural. It is not proof of intelligent agency within the warp, and it is certainly not grounds for destroying 3 centuries of research. You're going to let it spread. You're going to let this spread beyond the station because you can't admit that your entire ideology might be wrong. I'm going to contain a biological outbreak using appropriate medical and military resources. The affected areas will be sealed and sterilized. Personnel exhibiting symptoms will be quarantined and treated. The research data will be preserved for future study. Vasquez stood. You, Director Ferris, will be taken into custody pending a full investigation into your negligence and ideological deviation. Your access to station systems has been revoked. Minerva's higher functions have been suspended pending review. You can't. The station is lost. Don't you understand? It's already inside, already spreading through systems and structures and people. Every minute you spend pretending this is a normal outbreak, it gets stronger. It gets closer to the shuttle bays, to your ship, to the stars beyond. But Vasquez was no longer listening. He nodded to the soldiers flanking the door, and they moved forward to take Yolanda into custody. She didn't resist. There was no point. The decision had been made, not here but in the distant chambers of Earth's government, by people who had too much invested in the way things were to acknowledge the way things had become. As they led her from the room, she heard something. A whisper, barely audible, that might have been the ventilation system or might have been something else entirely. It sounded like laughter. The military containment operation lasted exactly 14 hours. The soldiers who had accompanied Deputy Director Vasquez were among the best the Omnistate could field. Elite troops equipped with the finest weapons and armor that human technology could produce. They moved through the station in coordinated teams, sealing affected areas, evacuating survivors, establishing defensive perimeters against the spreading contamination. They died in their dozens. The transformation had spread too far, adapted too quickly, learned too much from its early encounters with human resistance. The entities pressing through from the warp understood warfare in ways that human strategists could not comprehend. They attacked through dimensions that military training didn't account for, struck at weaknesses that physical armor couldn't protect. Soldiers began to see things. Comrades who had died hours ago, walking through the corridors, asking to be let through the defensive lines. Family members from distant Earth, calling out for help, begging to be rescued from the spreading horror. Enemies that existed only in nightmares, creatures assembled from the deepest fears of each individual mind. Some held their fire, unable to shoot at faces they loved. They died quickly, consumed by the things wearing those faces. Others fired at everything that moved, at everything that might have moved, at shadows and reflections and their own allies. The defensive lines collapsed into chaos, soldiers killing soldiers, the carefully coordinated operation fragmenting into 100 isolated nightmares. Deputy Director Vasquez was among the dead. Or worse than dead, his body walking the corridors with something else looking through his eyes, his voice calling out orders that led survivors into ambushes, his authority used as another weapon against those who had trusted him. In her custody cell, Director Ferris listened to the chaos through the walls and waited for the end. The end came closer with every passing moment. Chapter 23 THE Archives gift deep beneath the station. In the sealed vaults of the archive, Dr. Elias Vance made a discovery that would have changed everything, if there had been anyone left to tell. He had retreated to the archive when the outbreak began, sealing himself inside the reinforced chambers where the Eldari artifacts were stored. It was the most defensible position on the station, and it was also, he hoped, far enough from the epicenter of contamination to remain safe while he tried to understand what was happening. The spirit stones were active, all 17 of them glowing with light that pulsed in coordinated rhythms, singing in frequencies that he could feel in his teeth. And they were communicating, not with him, but with each other and with something beyond. He had spent years studying these artifacts, cataloging their properties, theorizing about their function. He had believed they were data storage devices, crystalline matrices holding the recorded consciousness of dead Eldari. He had been wrong. They were prisons. The realization came to him in fragments, in impressions that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. The Eldari had not created the spirit stones to preserve their dead. They had created them to trap something else. Something that existed in the warp, that fed on consciousness, that had been preying on the graceful species for millions of years before humanity was born. The stones were cages, and humanity, in its ignorance, had been keeping those cages in close proximity to psychically sensitive subjects for centuries. Every navigator who had been studied near the archive, every psycho-adjacent researcher who had worked with the stones, every experiment conducted in their presence, all of it had been weakening the cages, feeding the things inside, teaching them how to reach through. Vance stood before the central display case, watching the stones pulse with light that was no longer beautiful but terrifying. He could see them now, the shapes within, not Eldari consciousness but something else, something that had been waiting in the dark for so very long. "You understand?" said a voice behind him. He turned to find Navigator Lydia Chen standing in the doorway of the chamber. Her eyes had changed. They were larger now, the irises split into fractal patterns that seemed to extend in directions the eye couldn't follow. Her skin was marked with the same patterns that covered the spirit stone casings, the symbols he had cataloged and studied without ever comprehending. "You were right to feel watched," she continued, moving into the chamber with a grace that wasn't quite human. "We've always been watching. Through the stones, through the navigators, through every breach you made into our home. You thought you were studying us, but we were studying you. Learning your fears, your desires, your weaknesses. Learning how to reach you. The outbreak, the transformation, it's not contamination, it's invasion." "No, invitation." Lydia smiled, and there was something terrible in that smile, something that remembered being human but had moved beyond such limitations. "You invited us in. You built the bridges, opened the doors, created the vessels. Everything that is happening you made possible. We're just accepting your hospitality." Vance's hand moved toward the emergency destruct controls that would slag the archive and everything in it. But Lydia was faster. Her hand closed around his wrist with strength that no human body should have possessed, and he felt something probe at the edges of his mind, something vast and curious and utterly alien. "Don't be afraid," she said, and her voice had harmonics now, layered tones that spoke to parts of his consciousness he hadn't known existed. "The fear is just the old self, clinging to limitations it no longer needs. Let go. Join us, see what we've always wanted to show you." The stones were singing louder now, their light filling the chamber, and Vance could feel the cages cracking, the prisoners straining to be free. He could feel them reaching for him, offering him the same transcendence they had offered Lydia, the same liberation from the cage of matter and mortality. He could feel how easy it would be to say yes, to stop fighting, to become part of something larger, something eternal, something that would never be alone. But somewhere in the depths of his scientific mind, a single thought remained clear. The Eldari had built these prisons for a reason. The graceful species that had lived for millions of years, that had mastered technologies humanity could barely comprehend, had looked at these entities and decided they needed to be contained. What had the Eldari known that humanity had refused to learn? "No," he said, and with his free hand, he triggered the destruct sequence. The explosion consumed the archive, vaporizing stones and specimens and everything else within its radius. It was a small victory, too small, too late, but it was something. 17 cages that would never be opened. 17 prisoners that would never be freed. In the spreading chaos above, no one noticed the flash of light from beneath the station. No one recognized the slight disruption in the growing network of transformed consciousness. The war was already lost, and one small battle meant nothing in the end. But Elias Vance had made his choice. He had seen the truth and rejected it, had understood what was being offered and refused. And in the calculus of souls, in the strange arithmetic that governed the relationship between the material and the immaterial, that choice mattered more than he could have known. The entities noted it, they remembered it, and when the time came to write the final chapter of humanity's story, his name would be among those recorded as having stood against the tide. For whatever that